Okay, Jim, let's talk about the so-called freedom movement, and it's developing disturbing parallels to the Reclaim Australia.
Indeed. Look, I've been following all of this incredibly closely, and some members of Australia First and other supporters have participated from time to time in different parades that have been organised by the Freedom People. I want to make one thing absolutely clear, is many of the demands made by the ordinary people are completely correct. If you're a worker, you shouldn't be subject to mandated vaccines. You shouldn't have your civil rights stripped away at the request of a health minister. Police should not operate to enforce laws that make no sense. I am not in any way talking now about the people who attend the demonstrations. I'm talking now about some people who have been organising these demonstrations and the purpose to which they may in fact be put. This was always the case. If we go back in time to, say, 2014, 2015, there was a so-called Reclaim Australia movement that came on the scene. These people were concerned, they said, with the dangerous effects of political Islam in Australia, and they built themselves up into a quite sizable phenomenon. Facebook pages were created, forums, debates, street parades. The usual suspects of Antifa were called out to do violence to them. It was a big thing there for about, well, say 2.5 years, suddenly gone, as if it never ever was. And the issues they raised, and by the way, some of the issues remain valid. There are issues relating to political Islam in Australia today that are as valid now as they were when they were touted by these people. But the movement is gone. The actors are gone. The Facebook pages are gone. Any organisations based upon it are gone. And it's almost as if they're not just gone, but they were shut down. Now, a couple of years after that, there emerged another movement that went for a shorter period of time back in 2019, which was a movement highlighting the unfortunate situation of white farmers in South Africa. Now, this movement had a number of street parades in all Australian capital cities, but it had the support of characters like Goodenough and Hastie, Liberal Party MPs. And they were very active.
That's Ian Goodenough and Andrew Hastie.
Indeed, thank you. And you had the support of the unfortunate Fraser Anning, the so-called Conservative National Senator, as he became. These movements pointed out a number of things that are of themselves quite true. There's no doubt that there are racist attacks in South Africa carried out by extremists from particular political groups upon Europeans who are simply tilling the land and minding their own business. And then it was put that Australia should welcome some of these people as refugees. Now, this movement was also one that was simply wound up and disappeared at some point of time in 2020. You can argue, oh, coronavirus did that, but not really. We're out of the coronavirus problem now to a great extent. This movement has not been revived. But what has now come on the scene is a freedom movement. As I said, many of the demands of the freedom movement are in fact quite correct. And it would be, in my view, the view of Australia First I would add too, quite right for nationalists to take up several of these demands and solidarise with the people who raised them. But again, what do we find? We find at the top of the movement there is a certain amount of usage. Now let's go back to Reclaim for a moment. Reclaim had valid points, but there was another agenda there. The agenda was that Australia should be involved in the politics of the Middle East, that Australia should take the side of the USA and the Israeli state over Middle Eastern questions, that Australia should increase its security budgets in Australia here to monitor so-called terrorists. This was a classic Liberal Party agenda. Let's go forward to the South African farmers' movement. It was a convenient way to drum up support with a small but very vocal section of well-meaning people who were related to people in South Africa who had been the victims of this sort of violence. So what do we find? we find groups of migrants, expatriates from that country, usually and necessarily English speakers. The Afrikaner people do not migrate for the simple reason that South Africa is their motherland, their fatherland, they have nowhere else to go. But the English speakers, it's a little bit different, product of the colonial age, and a lot of them have turned up in Perth, and Goodenough and Hastie found them a very viable political market to do their electoral work in 2019. We look now at the freedom movement. What's happening? Well, at the top of it, you have someone such as Craig Kelly. Who's Craig Kelly? Well, you could argue that he's a rather overweight buffoon. Yes, you could. But that's not quite the answer here. Craig Kelly, of course, claims that he broke with the Liberal Party over certain matters of freedom principle. Well, you break with a party, but do you break with its ideology? I haven't seen it. I've been over Craig Kelly's website, his public statements, his press releases. I can't see anything that Craig Kelly really says or does that is essentially non-liberal. Who's his master? Well, Clive Palmer. I've been over the websites and public statements of Uncle Clive there for years, and I haven't seen anything that is contrary to Liberal Party ideology and politics. Essentially, Palmer and Kelly are liberals. Disgruntled ones over a couple of questions, yes, but basically they are liberals. So what's happening? Well, we've got an election coming up. It's likely to be a very divisive one, undoubtedly so. So what do? You run your own satellite structures. Craig and Clive, they run a machine that siphons preferences, defeats the other side, raises the general line that somehow along the way the Liberal Party will address these questions. Whoopie-doo. We follow too that Craig Kelly and Clive are in bed now with Campbell Newman, former Liberal Party Premier of Queensland, who is also a Senate candidate for the Liberal Democratic Party, a party that also essentially is, well, liberal, all intents and purposes. They may take a Senate seat in Queensland. They might also make it highly problematical for another satellite party that's run its course, One Nation. And we might see Pauline Hanson turfed from Parliament and replaced by Campbell Newman or one of Palmer's other nominees. But essentially, they're running Liberal politics. In fact, we've seen Scott Morrison and some of his senators prevaricate over matters of freedom. Should the vaccinated and the unvaccinated be equal? Should it be mandated or not mandated? Uncle Scott there has made it clear that there are constitutional issues even. Not that he does anything about it, of course, with the issue of not being able to travel across state borders, impose work conditions on people and so forth. So, how do we look at the freedom movement then? Is it necessarily a movement controlled from below by very well-meaning people who wish to see certain wrongs put right, or is it actually a movement run from the top down? If we look at Reclaim and the South African farmers movement, it was a movement run from the top down by very, very efficient and dedicated agents. I use the word agent in a neutral sense. Therefore, should nationalists and other patriots support the freedom movement? I would say that we have to raise freedom issues all of our own, and in a part we have to run our own race in advancing these issues. That doesn't mean to say that we can't work with many of the people at street level and from time to time, because many people have legitimate things to say. But would I or anyone else who is a nationalist put any faith in people like Craig Kelly and Palmer? Well, no, you wouldn't. I'll also make the other comment about Palmer. A few years ago, he ran a very expensive and very all-Australia program to say that China was a threat to Australia. Well, yes, China is most certainly a threat to Australia. But back then, as you'd remember, the Liberal Party was all in bed with China. China was the great trade partner. China was opening up Australia to investment. Australia could only do well, as John Howard said, China will become more middle class. It might even become democratic. So what did Clive do? Well, Clive ran a campaign saying it was a security threat. What was Clive really doing? Is Clive really a nationalist or a patriot? Well, no. What he was doing, folks, was he was flying the kite, in the words of a song, to see how the wind blows. And that's what he was doing. He's doing it again. He's making points about Australia and its defence posturing. He's saying that we need to do a lot more in defence. The Liberals always run people out there to suss and poll the population for shifts that come later. Now we see that the Liberal Party is posing as the ultra-patriot party. They're all concerned that Australia might lose its freedom or even be attacked by China. Well, nationalists said that 8-9 years ago, and we were accused of racism for saying it. Clive will run many other issues like that, and the freedom movement will be manipulated by people like him to that end. I'd make another prediction for you folks. After the next federal election, and when it's all over and done and dusted, the freedom movement will be very quietly wound up, just as the South African movement was done, just as Reclaim was done. And if we had time today, which we don't, just as other movements of similar nature were set up and organised by the Liberal Party, and they suddenly disappear. The actors are never even aware necessarily that they were manipulated. The movement simply vanishes around them. It's very sad. It's an indictment of Australian politics, but it shows you essentially how well organised from the top down Australian politics really is. That means we need, obviously, a movement from below and a party outside of those quarters. Thanks very much for listening.